Welcome to Substance Free 02043, brought to you by Hingham Cares. I'm your host, Kristina Root, and I'm President and Program Director of Hingham Cares. Our mission is to reduce substance use among youth in our community, and we do that by providing information and programming like this podcast. Our guest today is Chris Herren. Chris is a nationally renowned speaker in the field of prevention and recovery and is founder of the Herren Wellness Center in Seekonk, Mass. It's great to have you with us today, Chris.
It's great to be here with you.
So let's start by learning a little bit more about you. Could you share with our listeners some of the highlights of your life, where you grew up, your career in basketball, your family?
Yeah, so I'm from Fall River, Massachusetts. I have an older sibling. My dad and both my mom and dad had my brother and myself when they were relatively young, right, in their early 20s. They are one of 7 siblings on both sides, and we grew up a little hard in the beginning. My parents worked extremely hard to kind of pull us out of the projects in Fall River, and they did a phenomenal job at that. My dad became, an elected official, a state representative in Fall River, Massachusetts, and my mom worked for the telephone company, which eventually, it's from New England Telephone to Verizon, and she worked for them for like 30 years. So that's kind of the backstory. I also come from a very athletic family, on both sides, the Careys, my mom's side, and the Herrens. My brother really was the one who I followed growing up. He was, Massachusetts Player of the Year multiple years in a row, went on to play basketball at Boston College on a scholarship. So that was kind of my blueprint to follow, which I did, right? Almost to a T. I ended up at Boston College.
And he was how much older than you?
5 years.
Okay.
Yeah, 5 years. So we never crossed paths in high school. When he was at BC, I was just walking into my freshman year at Durfee High School. I followed his blueprint and went to BC, and unfortunately, that's where really my struggle began. That's where the story of substance use and addiction that's where it was rooted. I was introduced to cocaine at 18 years old. Something that I planned on doing one time, one night, turned into a 14-year struggle with the substance. I didn't last at BC. I failed multiple drug tests, so BC and we parted ways. I ran from my addiction. I figured if I moved to the West Coast and play basketball in California, I would have some freedom, and I didn't. And I struggled there as well. That's when at 21 years old, I entered my first treatment center on a 28-day program in Salt Lake City, Utah. My career obviously is basketball. That's the background, but the real background is the addiction that was behind it. And I battled with that since I was 18 years old.
So you are a person in recovery, and you're very open about your journey. It's the subject of the speeches that you do. When did you start using substances, and what were you using at first?
I started drinking, right? I kind of drank the beer I never wanted. My dad struggles with alcoholism.
What do you mean by that, the beer you never wanted?
I was a child in a home of alcoholism, right? I despised it at a young age. I knew something about that Miller Lite beer can was fracturing my family, was hurting my mother. In my adolescence years, I didn't know what an alcoholic looked like. I didn't know what an alcoholic was. I just knew that my dad's drinking was having a major, profound impact on our family. So that's the beer that I never wanted, right? It was the beer that I grew up despising. And unfortunately, I started drinking it as a child. I was 13 years old, a boy.
What was the impetus for that first drink? Did somebody offer it to you, or were you just trying?
No, it was a beer that was around the house, right? It was like, I was curious, right? Like my mom and dad really struggle with this. It has to be really good if my dad's willing to risk everything, kind of. That was my first experience with it. 13 years old, and then transitioned into smoking a little marijuana in my early teen years, and obviously continued with that throughout high school.
Would you say that you were a partier in high school, or were you more of an athlete, or did you somehow balance the two, in your own mind, balance the two?
Yeah, I was probably both. Bill Reynolds, who wrote the book about me when I was 16 years old, he kind of embedded in Durfee High School for a couple of years to write the book. he'd be the first to tell you that has been on record saying that he didn't see it coming because I was always so busy with basketball. I was constantly traveling. When all my friends were hanging out on weekends, I was in another state playing basketball somewhere at a very high level for high school kids. So when I didn't have basketball, when I wasn't traveling, I was definitely partying.
So in 2011, you released a film about your career and the devastating impact that drugs were having on it, as well as on your family. And it's no secret that you were struggling going all the way back to your failed drug test for marijuana and cocaine in 1994 when you were playing for Boston College. You were then kicked out of school for failing subsequent drug tests. And so it seems like that was pretty brazen behavior for you to be playing and knowing that you would have to take these drug tests and yet still engaging in substance use. Did you expect to keep that secret hidden, or did you even care at that point?
Yeah, of course I cared. And we already talked about failing the drug test at Boston College, but it was something that I leaned into, right? I was an 18-year-old boy with stress and pressure, and substance was my crutch. Thankfully I learned, having children today, that, there's many more skills required for children to cope and to get through. I wasn't given those skills at a very young age.
When did your battle with opiates begin?
My battle with opiates kind of was always there, right? Like, it was a drug that I didn't respond well to, right? I say it all the time. There's people who take a Vicodin or a Percocet after surgery and they feel horrible. And then there's the people who feel great with that in their system. Unfortunately, in 8th grade, I had a knee surgery. It felt great. I had multiple surgeries throughout my career, and painkillers were always not directly linked to my story, but they were around. It really wasn't until I got into OxyContin that I feel, when I was 24 years old, when I was playing professional basketball, did my daily battle with opiates begin.
Did anyone in your world recognize that at that point?
When I started taking OxyContin in 1998, 1999, it wasn't in the headlines, right? It was not relevant in society. It was not discussed, warned. It was a new drug, experimental drug, basically, and nobody was really familiar with it. But, for me, unfortunately, the world of opiates and being dependent on a daily basis, I worked really hard to keep that secret. There's a lot of pain behind it, and I didn't want to let my family know how much pain I was in, how much struggle, and I didn't want to also bring it into their world. So I tried really hard for multiple years to hide this as well as possible. And I say it all the time, like, when I was in the world of opiates, I had plenty of money to buy them. I had plenty of resources to buy OxyContin. And the people that I dealt with, the drug dealers who I met, they would always say to me, like, Chris, why don't you just give me 20 grand and you never have to see me again for 6 months? And I came every day. I came every day and got my daily, dose that my body, my addiction required, because I never wanted to do it tomorrow, right? Like, I always had this sense that, like, I don't want to do this tomorrow.
You were going to kick it at some point.
It's torture, right? And what it does to a family. The last thing, I'm looking at my children playing with toys on the floor, and I'm meeting a guy and, ultimately taking a chance at dying. Every morning I did that for almost 10 years.
That's incredible. And there's a lot of shame that goes along with it too.
Oh, there's a ton of shame. Yeah, there's a ton of shame. And there's also the shame of adding shame to someone else's life, right? Like, mm-hmm. I knew that shame was going to transition into my wife's world, into her family's world, to my children, right? So you try really hard to guard that. You try really hard not for your addiction, not to kind of ripple into the people who love you. And I tried really hard, but, eventually that all, it all came out.
I think that is a pretty common thread when it comes to addiction, whether you're addicted to alcohol or any other substances. It doesn't really matter. So you're talking specifically about your addiction to opioids, but that same mental process applies to any form of addiction, correct? Would you agree?
Yeah, of course. I think, not many people walk in on a winning streak, right? I mean, everyone's kind of struggling. Everyone has some pain and some trauma that they're dragging along with them. You don't see people walk into Herren Wellness with, excited. You see them sad and defeated in a sense. But the beauty is you see their family with a smile behind them. That's the beautiful part of this, is that you're helping the one walking in, but the family behind them are just so relieved.
Before we get into the Herren Project and Herren Wellness, I wanted to ask you about your speaking engagements. So for the past 15 years, you've traveled the country as a speaker, talked to countless numbers of teens and adults. The landscape of substance use has changed pretty dramatically since you began speaking. Can you describe what you've seen during those 15 years? Are there any trends that you've noticed or anything taking place regionally?
Opiates were kind of very prevalent, in the school systems when I first began. I think kids have shifted out of that somewhat. I think we've done a phenomenal job at really educating and making people aware of the dangers. And now it's the vaping, right? Now it's vaping nicotine, it's vaping marijuana. That's kind of where we've rolled into in the last 4 years. And that's basically what I see. I mean, but the truth is, I started telling my story and I stopped, right? So I walked into schools and I would tell my story and I would walk out and the schools would email me and the kids would say, God bless you, I'm praying for you, good luck, I'm so happy for your family. But they would never disclose. They would never talk about them. So I pivoted and I changed my approach. I worked extremely hard at kind of constructing a new approach. And again, it wasn't until I did a thing with Charlie Rose and Gayle King. I did the morning show and it was called a segment called Note to Self. And I had to write a letter to my younger self and it had to be 500 words and they were going to fly in and they would film me reading it. And initially, I was telling the producers of the Today Show or the morning show that I'll have this done tonight. 500 words is easy. And it was the most painful thing I've done in my recovery. To talk to that little kid in the bunk bed and kind of try to guide him through life. You can't change what happens, but you can talk to that kid how you wanted to be talked to or needed to be talked to. So that exercise kind of brought me back to the beginning. And that's when I started my talk the first day. Because again, I think when it comes to addiction, I think we've gone horribly wrong with the way we talk about it with children. I think we put way too much energy and effort and focus in the worst day and we forget the first day. I think for years, we tried to scare our children away from drugs and, here's an egg in a frying pan and this is what a drug addict looks like. But nobody talks about the very beginning. Like you said, the impetus. How did it start? And what's your why? And kids can relate to that. When I walk into schools today, I do about 200 high schools a year. When I walk into schools and I start talking about the beginning and why and what I was going through, kids can it's relatable because, those things are still very prevalent in their world. Self-esteem, self-worth, peer pressure. What I've seen over the last 7-8 years since I pivoted is just the amount of outreach has been tremendous as far as kids seeking help and wanting to talk about, their story and tell their story. So I'm very proud of the way I downshifted on this and changed the approach because we at Herren Wellness and Herren Project have been able to help so many young adults.
So we talk in the world of prevention about the underdeveloped brain, and a lot of parents don't understand that the teen brain is still in such a malleable state, and the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, so there's risky behavior associated with that underdeveloped brain. Do you feel, having shared your message with so many kids throughout the years, do you feel as though kids can kind of overcome that predisposition for risky behavior and that underdeveloped brain? Do you think that there's messaging that really resonates with them? Do you think there are certain tactics that schools can use? What is your take on that?
Well, I mean, not many schools even educate children about the genetic component of addiction. and the predisposition. So the fact that that wellness isn't a core class in our kids' school system right there alone tells you we're going to have children struggling because they're not given what's necessary, what's needed for them to kind of protect themselves through these while their frontal lobe of their brain is developing. We wait till it's too late to have these conversations. And when I walk into communities, whether it's in West Virginia or Florida, the kids who are most receptive to my conversation, to my talk, are middle school kids. They're the ones that are nodding their head. They're the ones that are kind of responding, identifying, and then raising their hands and wanting to disclose. When I first started speaking, it was like, we can't bring middle school kids in to your talk. And now there's communities that bring fourth graders, fifth graders, sixth graders. And ultimately, those are the kids that should. That's the age where we should start educating and discussing all of these factors that children face. There's kids today that have no idea of the genetic predisposition of addiction, and because they have it in their family, what the likelihood that they could possibly struggle, and we don't do enough about it. And to be quite frank, I think it's embarrassing.
Do you think that the responsibility falls on the shoulders of parents, of the school system, of the community? Do you think legislation plays a factor? I
think the whole spectrum plays a factor. In a perfect world, the parents are involved, the school system's involved, legislation's involved. That's the ideal situation. But I think we have an opportunity to work with children from 5 to 18. And we do so little in between those years to educate them on life, on wellness, on coping skills, on all the social measures that they would need to take, while they're growing up. And it's not every parent's present, but kids go to school, and it should be in the school system.
Moving on to the work that you're currently doing. So you founded the Herren Project in 2011, and then in 2018, you founded the Herren Wellness Center with Hingham native Lori McCarthy, who was co-chair of Hingham Cares at the time with me. Could you tell us about the mission of both of those?
Herren Project for me was real simple, right? There was someone there to pick me up when I was down, and that family extended themselves and gave me an opportunity to go to treatment and navigate that process that I was completely unaware of how to navigate. And obviously families, when they're in this position that I was in, sitting in an emergency room after just overdosing on heroin, it's tough to kind of slow down and say, okay, these are the next steps. Well, they picked that up for me, and they gave me an opportunity to go to a center in New York, in upstate New York. And the fact that I sit here coming up on 15 years sober, and what I've been able to do, not only with my life, but especially my children's, and the impact that recovery has had on everybody who's ever cared about me, who's ever loved me, I felt that I had an obligation to give back. Right? I wanted to be that phone call for someone when a family was like me. I wanted to be there on the other end of the phone saying, well, we have a place for you. And Herren Project started that way. And over the last 11 years, we've given away $8 million in scholarships. 3,700 people have gone to treatment because of Herren Project. Thousands and thousands of families impacted, and over the last decade we've kind of evolved. We kind of touch all areas, whether it's prevention. We have high schools all across the country that are involved with Herren Project, and family support groups online every day, 7 days a week. And obviously still the beginning of navigating treatment for people who don't have the resources or can't afford it.
I'd like to jump back to something that you had just alluded to, because I realized it was a question that I was going to ask you. What do you attribute your successful recovery to? And you mentioned this family that was very supportive. Who were they? How did they enter your life?
Yeah, the Mullen family was extremely supportive. They're the ones that gave me the gift. My recovery is it's who I'm present with, right? It's who I work with, how hard I'm invested in. And I've surrounded myself with people for the last 15 years who have just made me better, and supported me throughout this, right? I can't really pin it on to one person. There's so many people that have redirected me, impacted me, and led me into these 15 years of recovery.
That's incredible, and it's such an important message for people who find themselves struggling, that it really is in the company that you keep. And if you want to get away from that lifestyle, then you need to kind of examine who you're surrounding yourself with.
Yeah, I also think for me, and I tell people here at Herren Wellness, it's being vulnerable enough to know who you really are. Like to really get to know who you really become, where you're at in life. Like if you can identify that space, and then we can work up from it. And it really wasn't until I cried myself to sleep thinking about my children, my marriage, my family. I buried my mom. She died from cancer. I was still active on heroin. There were so many things that was unresolved and that I really wasn't taking a look into or a look at. And it wasn't until I identified who I really become that it gave me some inspiration to just rebuild. I think at the end of the day, we have to know, where we're at and where we want to rebuild from. And I was from the ground floor at that point in my life.
So it's all about honesty, really.
It is. It's a ton of honesty. It's a ton of self-reflection. It hurts, right? It hurt me. I was 32 years old. I had a 9-year-old son, a 7-year-old daughter, and my wife just gave birth to my youngest, Drew. And I'm in a treatment center in Rhinebeck, New York, and my wife's on food stamps, and we're struggling keeping the lights on in the house. We're struggling heating the home. We have no vehicle. My wife is driving a catering van that a buddy gave to her to drop the kids off at school. It was tough, right? And I could sit in that treatment center and say, I'm Chris Herren. I played for the Boston Celtics. This was just a little blip in the radar. I'm going to come back. I wasn't coming back. What I had to do is I had to figure out a way to come to a resolution with who I become and how I'm going to work from there.
If you had to encapsulate that into a simple message, what would that piece of advice be for young people about how to stay safe, how to make healthy choices when it comes to substances?
I think kids need to, and parents need to get involved in this too. They need to ask why, right? Like when you see a young kid struggling, it's their friends, it's their friend group, it's always external, right? You see a kid come in at 14 years old and he smells like marijuana or he smells like alcohol. The parent sits them down and says, who are you with? Where'd you get it? Who bought it? When'd you do it? How much did you do? But nobody asks why. Very rarely do parents sit down and ask their children, why did you have to do this to yourself?
Right.
Why did you have to consume alcohol, smoke marijuana to hang out with kids you've known since you were 4 years old? Something shifted, right? And you got to understand the shift. You got to understand the why. And I think it's extremely important to discuss those factors in young kids' lives. I think there's a lot of kids out there who, and why not, right? Like these teenage years can be miserable, right? I mean, it's ridiculously hard to navigate through, not to mention what kids have to face today and what they have to walk through in their early teen and teenage years. But that's why I think it's so important is arming them with the right skill set, with giving them, the right messaging, and ultimately getting to know who they really are and the kid they're becoming. I think one of the most powerful things that I've seen is when I have children think of who they are and think of their little brother and sister. And if their little brother and sister or their mom and dad got to really know the real you. I say this at events in communities, like when adults are leaving, like on your way home, think of your son or daughter. If they got to know the real you, how would they feel? Like your behavior that you keep secret, your actions that you don't show them, like who are you really? And if they found out who you really were, how would they feel? And I think children need to know that it's okay to understand the kid they're becoming and some of the choices they're making and the risk they're taking, but it's not discussed enough.
What was contained in that 500-word essay that you wrote to your younger self? Was there advice? Was there...
Yeah, it's all advice, right? And that's how they explained it to me, that, Chris, you're going to go through what you went through. You can't change that, but you can talk that child through it. You can kind of guide them through the storm the way you needed to be guided, the way you needed to be touched. And it was extremely difficult. right? Because as children, I say this, I've been to Disney World like 2 or 3 times in my life with my family. I don't remember a minute of it. But I remember that big fight that happened in my house that night when my mom packed up the car and left.
Wow.
I could tell you what she was wearing, but I can't tell you about Disney World. And that's the power of trauma, right?
Right.
That's what sticks. That's what resonates. That's what stays. So it was talking myself, right, through the storm. I think the storm it's relatable for some, not for all, right? But I believe every kid has one, and I'm sure they feel alone and misguided and not helped through some of those moments. So that's what the note to self did for me. It said, Chris, you got to start talking to kids about your early years.
You've already touched on this a little bit. You are a parent yourself of 3 kids, and I'm sure that there are lots of lessons that you've learned along the way that you've applied to raising them. If you had to give a piece of advice to parents, what would that kind of salient point be?
To me, the only point is to focus on their self-worth and self-esteem. I think a healthy kid in the soul, I think that's our greatest goal as a mom or a dad, right? To have a happy child. I heard in AA when I first went in, and I wish I'd never heard it, but you're only as happy as your unhappiest child. And,
Wow, I've never heard that before. That's so true.
So you sit with that, right? You can have 5 children flourishing, doing great, but that one struggling, you're with them. Christopher is 24 years old, Samantha's 21, Drew is 14, and my 2 oldest have never engaged in any type of substance use. Something that I'm extremely proud of, and something that they're extremely proud of.
They should be. That's impressive.
They walked through those years of self-doubt, self-esteem, self-worth, and managed those moments without alcohol, without nicotine, without marijuana. And I'm so proud of them for that. And I have my youngest is 14. He's kind of the sober kid in the family, right? Because I got sober the day after he was born. And so he's lived a very different life than my older children. And my older children sometimes will remind him that their childhood was much different. And they've been unbelievable role models for my youngest. But one of the greatest accomplishments in my life as a dad is my son told me he wanted to quit basketball. The fact that my son could call me and say, Dad, I can't do this anymore. I don't want to do this anymore. It does not make me happy anymore. I felt so full at that moment that he could pick up the phone and have that conversation with me. That was a huge success when he was 21 years old, and he played at Boston College for a couple of years. He transferred to San Diego. While he was at San Diego University, he just said, Dad, I'm not happy. And I said, let's pull it. Let's walk away, because your happiness is what matters most. And I think, that's kind of been my focus on my children, is just continuously reaffirming their self-esteem, their self-worth, and trying to continue to build them.
Especially given your family legacy. That must have taken a lot of courage for him.
Yeah, he's Chris Herren, right? He's Chris Herren. He went to Boston College. There's times I wish I never named him Chris Herren, right? I wish he had a different name, because my children, listen, I've been speaking for 15 years, and they've had to face a lot of this through social media, through messaging from other children, right? I didn't walk through this process alone. Everybody who loved me, my family, came with me, and they've all felt it in one way or another, right? In multiple ways. My son Christopher was getting messages from grown men that were vile messages about, tell your father to do this, tell your father to overdose. And this has been an unbelievable commitment over the last 15 years, not just for me, for my children.
Well, I'm sure they're stronger as a result.
Sure.
Everything that they've been through, they're a lot more resilient, and they've had the support of you and your wife. Now, Heather also works with the Herren Wellness Center, doesn't she?
She does.
She plays a role?
Yeah, she does. They all play a role. Like today, my son, both my children will be here. My youngest son knows more about the people in this center today than I do. He's like, he gets to know everyone. He sits down with everyone, and it's a family business. There's no doubt about that. And it's perfect because, I tell people all the time, like, one of the most common questions when I'm speaking is how often do you talk to your kids about addiction? And my response has always been, I don't. I talk to them about recovery. Mm-hmm. So my kids have grown up with recovery, and they've witnessed it, and I talk about it, and I tried very hard for the last 15 years to make recovery attractive. Not only for others, but for my family.
Can you just tell us a little bit real quick about the work that you do with Hingham High School? I don't know how instrumental you are in that, or if Lori's more of the negotiator there, but residents from Herren Wellness come and speak to students at Hingham High School, and that's made such an impact. We've heard anecdotally that that's the most impactful moment for a lot of kids in their high school experience, certainly in the health class.
It's beautiful, right? Vulnerability is powerful. And we have young adults here that we bring to Hingham High School, and they sit in front of those children in their health class, and they tell their story. And they sit up there for 10, 15, 20 minutes, and they pour it out there for these kids. And, like, for instance, this last group that went to Hingham, we had, multiple 19, 20, 21-year-olds, 1 year away from where those kids were sitting at their desk. And that's good to see. But for me, I also think it's good to see how, and I think that's what we've done at Herren Wellness, recovery's cool, man. Like, recovery's cool, and we make it that way. It's not like, oh, you're punished, you can't drink for the rest of your life. It's thank God you don't have to drink for the rest of your life. And that's what we do here. And kids walk into that school, and again, for me, I was done with the scare tactics, right? Like, this is how bad it got. And those kids walked in there with smiles on their faces, glowing, and not only did they tell their story, but kids knew that they were happy in recovery.
Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure.
It has. Thank you for having me on. It was great speaking with you.
I want to thank our guest, Chris Herren, for being with us today. For more information on Herren Wellness, go to herrenwellness.com. That's HERREN wellness.com. You've been listening to Substance Free 02043, brought to you by Hingham Cares. I'm your host, Kristen Root, and I hope you will tune in again. For more info or to get involved, go to hinghamcares.org.